It's great to welcome to the program today Eitan Hirsch, who is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and also author of the book Politics is for Power. It's so great to have you on, Eitan.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the things you talk about and write about in the book, which I find super interesting, is that oftentimes those who are what we might call political hobbyists, where they follow politics almost the way you might follow a sports team, where there seems to be a significant kind of entertainment component, they're often not actually activists in their community necessarily around issues or candidates. And that this can cause, well, it can cause a lot of different things. I guess I'll leave it to you to tell me what the repercussions are. But how did you first start sort of investigating this, and what are the repercussions of that phenomenon?
Yeah, so I was looking at a bunch of political science data. What do surveys, behavioral data tell us about how people are following the news, engaging in activism, partisan cheerleading? And yeah, I had this realization that was a little bit uncomfortable, which is that most of the ways that people are engaging in politics feels more like a hobby than actual power seeking, like trying to move politics or move government in a direction that they want. And so it's true that, like, if you're a real political activist, you probably are consuming a lot of news. But like 90% of the people who are consuming a lot of news are not doing any real politics. So it's mostly just, news consumption, arguing online, debating at the kitchen table, and being anxious by yourself.
And so what effect does that have in terms of who the actual activists are? And does that skew the priorities of the actual activists because there are so many hobbyists that aren't really participating?
Yeah, so right, it does a lot of stuff. For one thing, the people who are most engaged, first of all, have generally stronger ideological views than the people who are the hobbyists. Right? In order to get off your couch and do something, you have to really care. And right now, it looks like the people who most care are people who are really ideologically motivated, or people who have real strong local networks, like they are part of a church that meets regularly, and so they're brought into a coalition of activism through that. So a lot of the people who, they say they care, they're worried about the country. Most of them, unless there's something there's something in them that pushes them to do something, they're not doing anything. The other thing is that hobbyism is itself creating some problems. So if we're on the couch responding to certain kinds of politics with our attention, or with like maybe throwing a $5 donation, we might be making politics worse if the kinds of politics we're incentivizing is kind of people who play politics like a game. So, I give the example a lot of congressional hearings or primary debates where politicians are looking to make a viral video of themselves so that they can get dollars in their campaign coffers. And if we sitting at home are waiting for them to fight or be provocative or say something extreme, we're actually the ones incentivizing them to act like that. So we at home, it's not just that we're not doing anything or wasting our time, although I think we are doing that. We're also in some ways making politics worse.
I feel like we sort of saw this in the first Democratic primary debate where Michael Bloomberg participated, where there was a lot of lead up to what's it going to be like with Bloomberg there. Within the first 30 seconds, Elizabeth Warren used the phrase horse-faced lesbian and fat broads in quoting things that Michael Bloomberg was accused of saying. The ratings were crazy. I had a bunch of people tell me this was like the best debate. And then I said, well, what was it? Because there was the least policy discussion of any debate that I can remember. It was cartoonish. From an entertainment perspective, I could see why somebody who's looking for fireworks enjoyed it. But we probably learned the least about what it is that these individuals would do if they were the Democratic, the elected president, hypothetically.
Yeah, and I think it's easier for people to take this point if they look at the other side. So if you're a Democrat, you should take some lesson from the fact that by far the biggest rating of any primary debate or any general election debate are debates where Donald Trump is on the stage. That provocation, that kind of outrage, that's what gets attention. And it's true whether it's on the left or on the right. Meanwhile, there are really important debates happening all over the country, for like governor, where no one's paying attention because it is a actual policy debate on real concrete issues. But without that antagonism, it's no fun for people to watch. And if the only reason you're engaging in politics is for fun, then, you're not going to watch.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, which I don't know if has come up recently in the interviews you've done, is there are probably some hobbyists that we would be better served by them not actually getting involved. So, for example, white nationalists on Twitter. I would prefer they only be tweeting and not actually be doing white nationalist stuff in their communities. Is there always some other side to these analyses that has to be considered where there are coalitions, for example, like under Donald Trump, that are more activated than they've been in a while, where we want to relegate them to the least visibility possible?
So I think on average, people whose preferences are more moderate and actually more left are the ones who are really succumbing to hobbyism the most.
Mm.
It's absolutely true, and I say this quite clearly in the book that there's a lot of people who can take lessons from the book from all sides of the political spectrum, and it's just a matter of whether the people that I like or you like or anyone likes wins on that front. And right now, I think there's a mistake that a lot of liberals are making, in particular, which is that they think that Donald Trump is doing really well among these like online white nationalists or something like that. And they're mistaking that, like, no, actually, most of his coalition are not people with extreme views. They're people who might not even like Donald Trump. They might be embarrassed by Donald Trump, but because they're connected to a community of people and because they have actual, preferences on issues like, reproductive rights or whatever, they're going to get out to vote even when the candidate is not exciting. And I think that the hobbyism, if everyone was to be more participatory, I think we probably move in a moderate direction or probably a left direction too. But it's true. Anyone can take the lesson of being an activist, no matter who they are.
Is there some degree to which the notion that doing some paying attention is always better than doing none maybe is questioned by some of what you write, in the sense that paying attention, for example, if there was a study from PIPA years ago, kind of a famous study, that found that if you exclusively or primarily get your news from Fox News, you actually are likely to know less on a factual basis about what's going on in the world than if you don't watch any of this stuff and presumably just talk to people and read books and so on and so forth. Where does that fit into your analysis in terms of the sort of degrees of involvement that people have with what's going on in political news, the political systems, elections, et cetera?
So, yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to judge anyone for how they want to spend their leisure time, right?
Yes.
But if you are like obsessively spending your hours like watching congressional hearings and the impeachment trial and presidential primaries and following the horse race of the primary, you're not learning stuff that's useful for you to be a citizen. And so I think people mistake following that stuff for being politically engaged and involved. There are people out there right now, because they followed the primaries, the Democratic primaries, so intently. They know more about the rules of the Iowa caucuses than they know about how power flows through their own state or local political party. I read the newspaper every morning, and like for the people who the day before spent 4 hours watching a congressional hearing, it takes me 3 minutes to get what I needed to get out of that in the morning paper. And so I would say, look, leisure time is pretty zero sum. You can't just spend your time on everything. And if you're only prioritizing national drama and horse race stuff, you probably don't have time to also pay attention to the really important stuff going on where you can have an impact. But you're also just like learning about politics in this way that's really, it's just not going to tell you what you need to do to be involved. So look, does it make you a worse person? I just don't think it makes you a particularly good citizen. And I think that folks should recognize that if they're following that stuff, it's more for their own entertainment than for anything else.
Can you talk a little bit about why that type of more direct community engagement is down among those who have college degrees? That's super interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for this, but that's right. So the hobbyism behavior, like people spending most amount of time in non-engaged ways, is among this college-educated class, particularly college-educated white citizens who follow a lot of news, they know a lot of facts, but they're not engaged in their communities. And one question is like, oh, so why is that? Why is that true? And part of the answer is that for people like this, they're pretty comfortable and they have comfortable lives, and so they're not particularly eager to get off their couch. But on the left, I think you have a special problem, which is that suppose you're on the left. If you say, if people ask you what issues do you care most about, you might say like the environment or racial equality or something like that. And then there really are plenty of state and local versions of those policy fights about, say, the environment or racial equality. The problem is you're going to have a lot of disagreement with your neighbors and your people in your town and your state about those issues. Like you might, it costs you nothing to say, I want a Green New Deal or I want an international climate change. It costs you a lot to say, I want our gas taxes to go up in our state. I want to pay all sorts of costs, and not just me. I want my neighbors to pay those costs, to pay for those bills. Now all of a sudden, like for one thing, you might not be so liberal if that's what you were before, and you actually don't want to fight with your neighbors about it. And so your reaction is to say, oh, only the important stuff is happening at a national level. I can't pay attention to that. I'll just I can only pay attention to the national stuff. I won't deal with the local stuff because it's too hard and my neighbors disagree with me. And, maybe I don't care as much as I say I care.
That seems to be much easier with the sort of modern social media status quo that we have, right? In the sense that in terms of what you're posting on social media, it's much easier to have broader appeal and more responses, likes, whatever, if you're posting about something nationally that the United States might do than if you're posting about what your town should do in terms of frequency of recycling pickup or whatever the case may be. Is this significantly exacerbated by social media?
Yeah, I think it's exacerbated by social media because the relationships are shallower. So, what I often say about this is like, if you can tell if you're engaging in politics as a hobby if no one is depending on you. Like if you could just stop giving your hot takes online for a week or two and no one's going to call you and be like, oh, we really miss your hot takes. Like, where were you this whole time? Like no one's going to do that because those relationships aren't really serious because you're not actually asking anyone. No one's depending on you. If you're engaged in politics in a real way, like you're trying to move people, you're part of an organization with goals and strategies. If you take a step back, people are going to be like, hey, we need you here. And so I think that it's because those relationships are so shallow online, because we can get that emotional catharsis so easily, that we've transformed politics even more into a hobby as opposed to a power-seeking behavior.
When it comes to what people can actually do, there's a whole bunch of, range of things that people talk about. We have sort of at one end, you sign an online petition, maybe you send a fax to your member of Congress, or you call or email or something like that. On the other end, we have these ideas of if you really want to make change, you have to coordinate general strikes all the way up to strategic, loan defaults to cripple an economy. There's like very, very, very broad range. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in terms of risk reward or work reward, so to speak, as the areas of real involvement that are most effective?
Sure. I mean, we could talk for a long time about this, but the short thing I would say is that think about how to convert your own vote as a citizen into more votes. Like, do you have it in you, based on your time that you can put into politics, to get 100 other people to take some action they wouldn't otherwise take? There's going to be some local fight or state fight in your area, wherever you live, that's about some issue that you care about, right? If you're on the right, maybe it's about religious liberty or economic development. If you're on the left, it's probably about the environment or schools or healthcare. And, can you get a bunch of people who are not engaged in local and state issues to vote how you want them to vote? And how would you go about doing that? You would have to build some trust with them, make sure that they think that you have the same values as them, be empathetic to what they're saying. And, I think one of the things that the organizers I study in this book are doing really well is they're really counting votes. They're saying there's one guy who's 98 years old in the book. People call him the Ukrainian boss, controls 1,000 votes. His precinct has 3 times the turnout rate of all the precincts around it. And everyone attributes to this one person who's built a lot of respect for his neighbors, and they all vote how he thinks they could vote. I think that's very tangible for anyone if they start thinking about, okay, if I can convince one other person, I've doubled the power of my vote. If I can convince 100 people. And so people will have different levels of their willingness to participate in this kind of politics. But if you are engaged in politics the real way, which is, again, with a strategy, with a goal, trying to move the government forward, you got to think about it in terms of counting votes, counting voices, instead of paying attention to interesting stuff.
Along those lines, at the national level, Senate races, governor, et cetera, I've long suspected that if you consider the sort of time and energy required to get someone to flip their vote versus simply, because we don't have mandatory voting, finding people who are unlikely to vote but already agree with you, my instinct is the time and energy is way better spent just getting the vote out with people you don't have to convince rather than arguing with people. And I think, imagining me arguing with a Trumpist in North Dakota trying to get them to change their vote versus just finding 10 Democratic votes, it seems instinctually accurate, but is it? Do you have a feeling about that?
Yeah, we for sure know that's true. Like if you're in a situation where it's a Democratic versus Republican election, and you have the choice of like trying to persuade a bunch of people on the other side or turn out the people on your side, we actually know a lot more from great experiments about how to increase turnout without trying to persuade anyone, by giving people reminders, by taking people to the polls, by like making voting easier for them. What I would say is though, on a lot of the issues that people care about, there's much more persuasion to be done than we might think. And that's because, some people say like they live in a bubble. A lot of people say like, oh, I live in a liberal bubble or a conservative bubble. There's no one I need to convince. And what they mean by that is like everyone on the presidential election around them is basically going to vote the same way. But when it comes to actual issues, and those issues are more manifest in local and state elections, people are not such in a bubble. People have really different perspectives on this. Some people don't want to have a 5-cent increase in the gas tax. Some people don't really want to solve a massive transportation problem in a region. And so there actually is a lot more persuasion to be done than you might think. It's just not going to be in the terms of like, a Fox News and an MSNBC viewer fighting with each other. That's not going to be ever very productive.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with you there. We've been speaking with Eitan Hirsch, who teaches political science at Tufts University, is also author of the book Politics is for Power, which we are linking to. Eitan, so great having you on, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.